Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Welcome to the beginning of the last summer of IDLIB. And now that I've said it, it's got to be the title, so you can't dispute me. You see, you've got to beat me to one of these days. Even though you came up with last episode's title, which was very satisfied with. That was a very nice title, but it does look like, in light of maneuvers around Turkey involving everything that ranges from Finland, Sweden, and NATO to the ongoing progress of the conflict in Ukraine, it looks like the last summer of IDLIB might be much more vindicated than one may have expected because out of Syria, what we have here is that Russia has pledged to assist in the liberation of all occupied Syrian land, whether that be from the Kurds or Turkish militias or any other group, and it has come out definitively and said it will not allow a Turkish buffer zone in Syria. So the long-time tolerance that they've had for the zone in Syria, you can really establish this to about 2018, 2019 is when Turkey really officially went in and really put its own forces on the ground, on top of course, all the other groups it had supported. But until then, until Trump started waffling on whether or not the U.S. would withdraw from Syria, you had Turkey quickly step in to fill that void. You'll recall one of the more significant times was in October 2019 when, once again, the U.S. announced a withdrawal from Syria that never ended up happening. But upon that, you immediately saw a Turkish incursion into northeastern Syria to establish a buffer zone that they claimed was to establish a safe zone to alleviate the amount of refugees that have come into Turkey over the past course of the war. And then, of course, there also is Afrin, which was a Kurdish controlled city in northwestern Syria that was taken over by Turkish forces and their pro Turkish militias as well. And that was at the height of when the Western media was really trying to sell us on the idea of brave Kurdish fighters, of course, the Kurdish women warriors. There was that entire media narrative arc from about 2014, 2015 with the rise of ISIS up until about 2018, where they were very strong on the idea that the Kurds are the only thing standing between us and ISIS and that they are fighting the entirety of the ground war in both Iraq and Syria. That the Syrian forces have nothing to do with it, the Russians have nothing to do with it, the Iranians and their proxies have nothing to do with it, the Iraqis have nothing to do with it, and the militias within Iraq have nothing to do with it. That the entire struggle against ISIS is American and then some other Western air power with Kurdish boots on the ground. That was the narrative that they had stoked up for years. And you'll recall, at least I do, that in 2019, one of the things that went around both the media and social media is Trump betrayed the Kurds. There's this very funny cartoon of it's drawn the political cartoon style. I don't have it on hand right now, but it's the cemetery. And it has like some tribe about like dedicated to our Kurdish allies in the fight against Islamic terrorism or whatever, and it's just Trump plowing a golf cart through the cemetery. Um, it's one of my favorite political cartoons, and for the exact opposite reason that I think they would have intended. But what you have to understand about the Kurds before I get too much into the exact scenario, just to set the stage for anyone who either hasn't kept up too much with the war in Syria, because I know a lot of our coverage has shifted towards Ukraine and the spillover from that, so we do have a lot of new audience. But if there's any of you who are, again, not too well versed in Syria, just briefly, what has been happening with these Kurdish groups ever since they had started the fight against ISIS and pushed it back into just a few pockets in eastern Syria, where they still do pop up here and there, even to this day. A lot of it was, of course, they were U.S. backed forces. Turkey's had issues with the Kurds for a while, which I'll get into in a moment here. But they were U.S. and Western backed forces. And the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they're known today, because they had the rebrand from They were the YPG, which is the People's Defense Forces, which the
Yeah.
Turks considered a terrorist organization. So there was a whole rebranding process. They threw in a few other ethnic militias in there, and even Arab militias at that point, and ordered to say, "Oh, it's a completely new organization. We have no affiliation with the PKK or the YPG," which it's going to be pretty funny watching how all of this happens, and I'm it's a really uncertain future on that, but there's a lot of directions it can go. But point being is, you had, with the backing of Western forces, primarily American forces, these Kurdish ethnic gangs, if we're going to be honest about what they are, establishing themselves in control of areas that are about 90% Syrian Arab. And again, you'll get a few other ones such as Assyrian groups, Yazidis, whatever. And primarily what it is, it's the Kurdish minority in the positions of power, in the, at least on a local sense, displacing, looting, pillaging, taking homes from just the people who are living there. Again, whether they be Arabs or Assyrians or Yazidis or any number of different ethnic or tribal groups that exist in Syria. And they've done a similar thing in Iraq. You'll recall at the beginning of the Iraq War. It wasn't as severe because that's more of the Kurdish homeland, so to speak, insofar as that actually exists. But especially in northeastern Syria, I don't have the map on me, but you'll recall in the episode that we go through the map, that big yellow blob, again, most of the population there are Syrian Arabs, and their governors are American backed Kurdish militias. Now, there was initially some hope upon the U.S. withdrawal that the SDF forces would enter negotiations with the Syrian government and come to terms with them and broker some sort of agreement, which seemed very possible in light of Turkish incursions, that the SDF forces would have accepted Syrian aid, but they pulled out of that. They didn't accept that. Even going back to Afrin in 2018, they didn't accept that Syrian forces should aid them. So you'll have these Kurdish ethnic gangs, these Kurdish militias, who lose ground to Turkey and their proxies, while also simultaneously rejecting support of the Syrian government. Now, as for the Turkish militias in Syria, once again, that was just Turkey picking up the slack of a less active and involved U.S., especially in the light of Trump coming into office, that it seemed, despite how back and forth Turkey was after the 2016 coup attempt, under the Trump State Department, there was a certain degree of tolerance for Turkish actions in Syria to harass the Syrian government and, by extension, the Iranians and the Russians. But, of course, they would always be conciliatory. You'd see that narrative go back and forth where Trump would be very hard on Turkey, trying to put sanctions on them, waging a trade war, then calling up and being a buddy with Erdogan the next week. I mean, watching Trump and Erdogan together was some of the most entertaining content I think we've ever done on the show, just because of how back and forth both those men are. Now, I think one man is much more competent at that, and of course, he's the one who's actually still in power today, but that's beside the point. And with that, of course, you've had Syrian bolstered by Russian and Iranian aid, particularly Russian when it comes to air power, and Iranians when it comes to supplies and proxy forces, to assist in the liberation of these areas from these Turkish backed militias. And once in a blue moon, engagement with proper Turkish troops. There's been a few cases of that where there's have been some shelling back and forth between the two. And it would always be 2018, 2019. They would always push just a little bit into IDLIB. Then some sort of ceasefire was brokered, some sort of negotiation process was entered. And that pattern continued on back and forth, until eventually turned into a frozen conflict that it is today. But it appears, if we are to believe what Russia is saying, which, given the success of the war in Ukraine to a certain degree, and the moving of Russian forces that were previously in Syria, moved to Ukraine as a result of the outbreak of that military operation, moving them back into Syria, I do believe it suggests that maybe they're not going to commit everything to this, but they are willing to give their support to Syria in order to bring an end to this conflict. Now, I still do maintain that this conflict will be ended diplomatically. I still do maintain that this conflict will be ended at the bargaining table with some sort of negotiation between Russia, Turkey, Iran, as well as, of course, Syria and the Kurdish groups in Syria, as well as any other given party that may be involved in that negotiation, depending on how this goes over the next few months. So I still maintain that. I've said that for a while now. But I do believe we will see an escalation in Syria with the Syrian government trying to, again, put an end to this. I would imagine they would target the Turkish-backed groups first, again, such as IDLIB, that pocket in northwestern Syria. They can't really touch the pocket in northeastern Syria because it's surrounded by Kurdish forces. But I do feel with a weaker United States, with other Western powers that aren't really interested in it, that the Kurds and the SDF, as they're officially called, I should say, would be a bit more open to negotiation, that they would be able to be talked out of this. Now, I'm not saying no fighting will have to take place in northeastern Syria, but I do believe a diplomatic solution, if there is to be one, will come much sooner in northeastern Syria rather than northwestern Syria. But really, it's setting the stage now that Russia has the wind beneath its sails in Ukraine. I would say, just speculating, they want to continue this momentum. They want to continue the embarrassment of the Western world, especially with the internal state of the United States, whether that be economic issues, internal politics issues, which we'll get into, or the absolute dysfunction in Europe, especially in light of the energy crisis, or some of the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran regarding energy, as well as the United States and the Gulf states regarding energy and oil. I do believe that with that, they want a swift end to Syria. I don't think they're setting up to use Syria as some bargaining chip because, of course, it is their Mediterranean port. Tartus has hosted Russian ships for decades at this point, even back when it was the Soviet Union, and they have dug in to defend that. Of course, there have been the occasional Israeli strikes, but even though those picked up a few months ago and over the past few months, they seem to be tampering down again. We'll have some news about Israel in the next few minutes here. But it looks like the stage is being set for the final moves of the Syrian civil war, just in short.
Yeah, there has been an uptick in clashes. Much of it is the kind of stuff that we used to report on when, although I didn't call it then, but it was my Syria minutia minute, where I mean, all to say that there's ongoing casualties because of this war. Uh, what I will say is, casualties for the Syrian Arab army are less. Where before, 3 soldiers have been killed along with some civilians. Russia claims to have killed about its fighters in central Syria. And there was a Syrian intelligence officer in Daraa that was also killed. Another one, of course, with his life from a car bomb. But I mean, I was frankly very surprised when I heard that Russia would be willing to do this. The sources I saw, didn't give a link that isn't, to an official Russian government site. That isn't to say I disbelieve them, but I am surprised. And maybe being cautious, I thought about the wisdom of undertaking this. But I think you point out that Russia seems to be very confident. And the Syrian Arab army, again, just today or yesterday, again forced a retreat of American forces in the northeast of the country, near the Iraqi border. So that kind of back and forth is continuing to go on. But the big Turkish invasion that we were supposed to see, now 3 going on 4 weeks, has not happened yet. There's lots of talk about it, and but it still hasn't happened. And so far, until it happens, uh, uh, I think the fair claim that Turkey has this border well into Syria, I might add. But it's been a frozen conflict for 6 years, and there isn't there isn't much going on. And I don't see a lot of movement and a lot of effectiveness. Some Iraqi soldiers have been killed there, particularly this week. There was a couple that were killed fighting in Iraq, in that area where Iraq, Turkey, and Syria all meet. So I don't know. Is Erdogan just playing here? And I guess the bigger question is, what are the Kurds going to do? Um, are they finally going to begin working with Russia and with Syria? And I guess also tangentially with Iran, who has forces in Syria. Because, I mean, we're looking at another instance in history where America is going to abandon the Kurds. I mean, I remember before the first Gulf War, uh, the Americans giving the Kurds the assurance that they will be protected. And Saddam Hussein, according to reports, gassed them. Like, uh, his since his death, his assassination, the Americans have worked closely with the Kurds as well as the Israelis, but they've been kind of lacking in Syria. No, no one side wants to completely commit themselves to Syria for some reason. Um, Neither the Russians or the Turks or the Americans or the Israelis seem to be able to fully commit themselves. Now, Russia, after making threats to the Americans, when the Americans were suggesting in 2013 we're going to land forces in Syria, they backed off. And that was a naval dispute in the Mediterranean. And then the British Parliament said that they would not go. And that was that. So some kind of a shift happened. Probably because Ukraine was up and coming. So Turkey's Erdogan has managed to create this space that suits him very well. So he can bluster and bluff his way into saying all kinds of things, but as long as he's getting results, he's going to continue to do that. For instance, this latest NATO thing that's happening with him, he's been assured 50 F-16 fighters from the U.S. This is not dependent on his vote in NATO for the ascension of Sweden and Finland. He has also said until they come through, there are 73 individuals that Turkey wants extradited, beginning with 12. And Finland or Sweden have refused to extradite any individuals. So and he said today in a video, like, this is a long process. They're not just going to become NATO members overnight. They have to come up with the goods. He didn't say goods, but he means they're going to have to meet my demands if they're going to be in NATO. So he secured this position for himself, and I don't know, maybe Russia is aware that he doesn't really have the potential to go into northern Syria in an even more impressive way than he did in 2016. And now basically Russia is telling him, you better not. He's got his own levers, especially in the Black Sea. He can make things painful for the Russians there. I saw a report that he donated a Bayraktar drone to Ukraine for free. Now, the Bayraktar drones, after the initial 2 weeks or so, They're not very effective, and that's because the Russians have developed their multi-layered uh, air air defense systems. And essentially, what you saw in the beginning of the invasion in Ukraine is you saw troops rushing to get to Kiev, not really taking over towns, and they were away from air defense system support, and the Bayraktars could pick them off. But you notice the 40-kilometer long supply chain and other troops and armored vehicles that Nancy Pelosi wanted to blow up. The reason the Ukrainians wouldn't try to blow up those areas is because they did have a multi-layered air defense system. So all this to say that it's a goodwill gesture. He gave them one Bayraktar, but literally hundreds have been shot down. So they're not that effective anymore. Um, but he does have abilities. He's a very shrewd man. So I don't know what's going to happen. What will the Americans do? On the one hand, I think America realizes its own people don't care about the political football of abandoning the Kurds. Literally, this is the time to abandon the Kurds. No one will
Absolutely,
care.
especially considering the fact that the Bleeding Heart internationalists, I should say, all eyes are in Ukraine. They care about the plight of Ukrainian sovereignty or whatever, to the point where you'll get a little bit of pushback, you'll get a little bit
Hmm.
of dissent from it, but ultimately, I think when it comes to these people with their mindset, they will definitively say that helping Ukraine is far more important than helping the Kurds right now. Because Russia's a bigger threat than Turkey,
Absolutely.
blah, 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 blah. So now actually is the perfect time to cut the Kurds loose and to leave them to their fate yet again. And
Hmm.
it's something I'm all here for, don't get me wrong. But
Yeah.
once again, the Kurds will be spurned by the West, and as you said, there was the case during the Gulf War where the U.S. gave the guarantee of security to Iraqis, particularly Kurdish Iraqis, who would rise up against Saddam Hussein and would offer them protection. Of course, that never
Hmm.
happened.
Yeah.
There has been the war in Iraq since '03, which they have been relatively pro Kurdish, but not entirely. Of course, there's the multiple instances in Syria as well, and most recent being about 2019 when the U.S. was allegedly going to pull out. But point being is, the Kurds are still, even at this point, hopelessly pro-Western to the point where they have denied several opportunities of negotiation with Syrian governments by extension. Of course, that would include Russia, Iran, and even probably Turkey at that point. So we can see if they'll learn their lesson this time. There were some hints of that starting to happen in 2018, 2019, but those quickly dissipated once
Yeah.
they had another reassurance of American guarantees. But I am curious, especially with the recent performance of the American empire, even if there wasn't a definitive American guarantee to the Kurds, would they even value it considering the current state of the world? Would it even mean anything at that point? So it could be, even if Biden does go off his rocker or sends Blinken out to make some blowhard statement that, oh, of course we stand with the Kurds and we'll do what we can for them. I mean, at this point, I know that I was talking about how hopelessly pro-Western the Kurds were, but I think even they might reach their breaking point with the impotence of the American empire over just the past 5 months.
Yes. You know, um, the Kurds have some big decisions to make, and they have been used to, like many of the small countries in Eastern Europe. Uh, they have this meme, growling face meme, and in the back they have the button that says "Help me, NATO." Uh, uh, Kurds, that is running out, and um, I mean, you've noticed that America can only keep a certain amount of troops there. That they have not been able to increase the number. It's been a relatively small number that has, gone up and down. However, if there's a time to ditch the Kurds, it is now, and it's in America's interest right now to try to win Erdogan over as much as possible. I think the Americans see that the Black Sea is going to only increase in importance as the war in Ukraine goes on. If the Russians want to cut Ukraine off completely from the Black Sea, this will be disastrous. Primarily because I think some Western analysts prior to Brexit were probably thinking, okay, we've got these three really big economies in Europe: Britain, Germany, and France, and Ukraine has these hydrocarbons, and we're going to be able to supply Europe with energy and food, and Russia's going to be cut off, and
And of
it
course, that
will
was
be
also in America that was still producing oil and gas too, under even Obama
right,
at that
right,
point.
yeah. But I'm suggesting this is like 2013 and earlier, right?
Yes, yes.
But much of that strategy remained afterwards, and so what you had was this perfect plan, and uh, Russia would have a tiny sliver in the Black Sea, in the North Caucasus area, around Sochi and Gelendzhik and Anapa and all that, and that would be it. But now they're verging on like Ukraine not having any seaside territory at all, and that would be disastrous. Like as we've discussed in the show, Russia already has oil rigs off the coast of Crimea. Um, I think the bet was that the West would get those, right? That's what Burisma was all about, or one of the things Burisma was about as an energy company. And now, if that happens, I mean, there are much bigger stakes, and you hear Biden saying it, you hear his administration saying it. This is about the survival of the liberal world order. We cannot afford a defeat here. They are all doubling down. I hear less and less talk about negotiations. For them, this is something absolutely catastrophic. I would say, um, you know, many people think like it will take not just Ukraine, but one other war that will create a loss of confidence in the U.S. I don't think so. I think the outcome of Ukraine will determine that. And if the Russians get this, the entire former Ukrainian shore, it's over.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's on top of if this backing of a Syrian military operation is successful. Because I know Syria has long disappeared from public consciousness, but I think it would come very quickly back into it if you had not only a just complete beating black and blue of Ukraine at this point, where they lose virtually all of its coastline, they lose major industrial centers, they lose natural resources, are forced to become a neutral rump state, which it seems to be the direction's going right now. Of course, I can't project too far in the future. That's pretty much what Kissinger is suggesting Ukraine should become a neutral rump state. Once again, Kissinger also gave the green light for these topics to be discussed, but it seems like even his words being discarded now. So if Russia and what the way it seems to be going is very successful in Ukraine, combined with even just a moderate amount of success in Syria, confidence in the American empire is dead, definitively.
yeah, yeah, and this is why they need Erdogan. And I think even Erdogan wonders how much confidence he can place in the U.S. At the NATO talks in Madrid. Um, he gave indications mm, that maybe the methodology of the way NATO is handling this isn't quite right, and you know there could have been a diplomatic solution to all of this. I don't know how sincere he is about that, but I would read that just as him continuing to play both sides and basically being um, commitment free, because you know, he's in charge of a country that has like a rather long history, um, not as long as some of the other European states, but it is more or less an ethno state, uh, even if it's not, uh, 90% Turkish. Uh, that's not how he rules, and that's not how Turkey rules.
Well, I think
And
another
so,
interesting thing to point out is even though the Turks as an ethnic group are a very old people, of course, the way it happened, as
yes,
I'm sure
yes,
you
in
all
that
know,
sense, absolutely.
they migrated from Central Asia into it. They established the Ottoman Empire, which the Ottoman Empire was far from a Turkish state. It was just a mess, is the only way you can put it. A mismatch of ethnicities and the way that their ruling class function, that the sultans and again like the people who ran the empire, it was just a disaster. And Turkish national identity, as we understand it today, is a result of course, defeat in World War One, with people like Kemal establishing the modern Republic of Turkey. Now,
Hmm.
the visions of Kemal and Erdogan are much different, but you can see where Erdogan is, in some ways, a result of the Turkish identity that was built in the 1920s. Of course, Kemal wanted a ethno-nationalist secular state that really rejected the deep devotion to Islam, or at least the preferred form of Islam practiced by much of the Ottoman Empire by the time its fall. But point being is, Turkey as a national identity, is the idea of a Turkish state by the Turks and for the Turks, is still a very young idea. It's still very energized, so to speak, because even though they've had their history as the Ottoman Empire, that was their history as the Ottoman Empire, not as Turkey. And they are
Hmm.
very different, very, very different entities at that rate. Again, you could go on about this all day if you want to get into the exact details, but point being is, Turkey as a nation state, Turkey as really the core ethnicity of the country that it's in, is still an idea that is young and full of fire. And a lot of people, particularly as detractors within Turkey, and certainly I'm no fan of Erdogan or the Turkish nation as a whole. But point being, people are saying because of economic policies, which there may be some truth to this, he is throwing away Turkey's status as a major power. But point being is, if anyone else were in power, Turkey would not be where it is today. Like, love or hate the man, he's one of the most effective leaders in the world
Yeah.
today. Like, I wish my nation had an Erdogan. I wish every nation, Western nation, had an Erdogan. Somebody who would just have the audacity to really do these things, to really put yourself on the line in order to advance your goals. Now, I will reiterate, I'm not a fan of Erdogan or Turkey as a whole, but point being is, you have to admire good leadership when you see it.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that people have cited about Erdogan that I think can be more broadly contextualized is his, you know, working more closely with the religious right in Turkey, having a lot of them move to Istanbul to affect, voting demographics and so on. But I think a wider context, one should look at is there is already a sense that the liberal Western secular mindset, which is the groundwork for interpreting all kinds of world phenomenon, all kinds of projections into the future about how things will go. That is weakening, and I think this kind of reliance really you're seeing a counter move to it happening in Turkey, and I think that's maybe yet another shrewd thing on the part of Erdogan. Uh, that whole cosmopolitan nature of Istanbul, and the early days in the 90s when it looked like they were going to, they had like, um, an invitation status into the EU. I think he knew that if he went the religious route, the traditional route, he would basically forfeit his chances. However, I think that, again, uh, it's about, well, do we allow Turkey to be subsumed by this ideology? Because that is what will happen, right? Do we have a grudge with another country, so much so that we will have to go along with the demands of our allies who want to change our culture in order that we can defend ourselves from this historical adversary. And Turkey does not have that problem. Turkey has a much freer hand. And, you can see them in terms of Iran and Russia. All of these countries are beginning to assert new criticisms of liberal democracies, and some of that has already taken hold, like let's say in Hungary. So I think they smell blood even in the ideology. And all you have to do is look at America, who is the protectorate and the progenitor of this ideology, and all the groups within it that work out the details and how it's going to get promulgated. Like, uh, if you just witness America, I think ever since the Trump election till now, and particularly the last 2 years, it's a farce. It's a joke, right? I know because I grew up in a time where you could actually have televised debates about certain issues, and you can't have that anymore. That ever since Trump's election, that that has stopped, and it is that moment which has brought on these ideological janissaries because they sense that only one opinion is the right opinion, and
Nice use
immediately
of terminology there in light of the discussing Turkey.
I said janissaries. You're right. Yes, yes. Anyways, yes, I think even America worries about how much they can trust Turkey. And like, I mean, you're looking at like that's the strongest military power in the world conceding to Erdogan's demands for these two votes over two countries that have been working very closely with the West for decades, anyways, who already have like certain military development agreements and do joint exercises. And he's getting a batch of 50 F-16s. The sanction, the sanction for the F-35 program that Turkey dumped 1.4 billion in, that's been lifted. I hear. He's getting a lot of stuff that, like, even if everything falls apart with NATO, like, I mean, because of Turkey's opposition, because Turkey's opposition is still in place. They want to see results. So the vote is a tentative vote, and all that aside, like no matter how that turns out, they're still going to get these planes. And the F-16 is a superb plane. This is an extremely, extremely capable aircraft, right? Um, it's slightly older tech, but it will compete with just about anything
It's even still the
uh,
workhorse of American
in
air
modern
power to
warfare.
this point. I mean, I could get into
Yeah.
aircraft autism all day, but it's still the staple of the American Air Force, and I think even the naval force at this point,
Mhm.
the naval aviation. So, yeah,
I think they have to have but I think for naval they have to have two engines
yeah,
because it's
I think you're right, and I know a guy I could ask about this, and hopefully I can get him on the show one day. But I don't know, he's a bit shy about public appearances. But yeah, we could have an entire aircraft episode if I can get this guy on. And if you're listening, I think you know exactly who you are, and I think most of my audience, or at least some of the audience, probably also knows who he is. But I won't say because I don't know how publicized he wants to be. But
Mhm.
point being is the F-16 is nothing to sneeze at, and it's
Yes.
a fantastic aircraft, and especially for a secondary power like Turkey. I'm not saying that Turkey is like weak or insignificant by any means, but it doesn't, when it comes to its own aircraft and things like that, doesn't exactly have a strong domestic industry when it comes to that sort of stuff. So if we can get its hand on, American aircraft that are about a generation behind or have or are falling out of date, I mean that's still fantastic compared to, who it would be facing off against. Which if Turkey is going to go into any conflict, it's likely going to be some border dispute in the Balkans or the Aegean with either Bulgaria, Greece, etc. In
Mhm.
Syria with of course the Syrian force, in which case they'd probably have to contend with Russia at that point. Maybe anything in the Caucasus with Armenia, Azerbaijan, they would be able to do anything like that, or Iraq. So pretty much looking at what Turkey would ever need to use them for, the F-16 is a pretty good thing to have in your arsenal.
Yeah,
comparatively. It's not. It's because I doubt they're going in a one-for-one confrontation with Russia. I think the worst that would ever happen is they would confront Russian forces in Syria, in which case that's probably the most contentious threat that they have. But even say against if relations were to sour to the point between Turkey and Israel, not that they're particularly good right now, even that would be significant against the Israelis, and the Israelis are also particularly infamous for their lack of skilled pilots. I don't know how Turkey is in that department, but point being is it's not a bad aircraft by any metrics, just from
yeah,
an ingestion standpoint, and especially for the needs of what Turkey would need fighter aircraft for.
yeah.
But with that being said, we do have a few other items. You did touch briefly on Finland and Sweden getting the NATO and some of the demands that were put there. Turkey does have that as a bargaining chip in its cap. One other thing I have mentioned previously, but I will mention again because I also saw something about this, is when it comes to the State Department's attempts to sow schism within the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, Turkey has one particularly valuable bargaining chip because with that, they have more or less a veto power on who gets the seat of the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople within the Orthodox Church because it does fall within Turkish territory, and with Turkey's laws regarding religion, they have to be made a government official under the Department of Religious Affairs or whatever their equivalent term is for it. So they do have a bargaining chip when it comes to the nomination of, again, anyone who would take that seat. So if that seat is vacant within the next few years, which the current patriarch is an aged man, so it's a distinct possibility. Uh, they can leverage that against both the West and Russia. Like it almost sounds, and I hate to use the term because it just is beaten to the ground so much. It almost sounds medieval, the idea of a state authority being able to leverage, again, the position of a cleric against its rival on the world stage. Like this sounds like something out of the 11th century. This sounds like papal politics of the Middle Ages because there's really no other way to put it. And I do think that is something we're looking at as a distinct possibility within the 2020s at that point that Turkey will use everything, every cultural, religious, political, geopolitical, geography, everything it has to its advantage will be used over the next few years in order to secure Turkey's place for the coming decades, if not the coming century as a whole. So they're not going to pull out any stops, especially with Erdogan in power and people like him in power. They are going to get everything they can from everyone, and Turkey is going to be a hell of a power to contend with in the near future. And I think anyone who predicts Turkish decline because they had some trouble with their economic policy in the past years, I think that is overlooking the much bigger issues at hand.
Yeah, I mean that's just something that's it's very good that you bring it up because it's not on people's radar. But it is actually very very important, especially in that part of the world. And yeah, I mean we're going to see how that plays out. That's yet another card that he has. So uh, I mean, it's not a card I enjoy seeing him have. Don't get me wrong, but it is what it is, and you know, we're we're just gonna have to ride it out.
Yeah, and, and
Um,
one thing I will say also about that is when it comes to relations between church and state, if Russia does want to rebuild itself as a country with a basis, with the Orthodox Church as its basis, which does seem to a degree they're trying to do that, or at least trying to make it a significant part of society. And even with some of the things abroad, for example, uh, there was some citing of the current issues with Ukraine and the schism there that may have led to part of the conflict. Of course, one of the big propaganda pushes, and again, I use propaganda in its most academic term, a piece of media or information to persuade you, not as like any sort of sinister term. one of the big pushes they had when they went into Syria is they were defending the some of the oldest communities of Christians within their heartland. So that was another thing.
Mhm.
So I feel that even just from a purely political motive, Russia cannot afford to not be involved in this process via both the church and via state relations between Russia and Turkey. I feel like that in order to maintain credibility, this is a process that they're going to have to be involved in the near future. And if Russia can successfully court Turkey as it has been doing to a minor degree of success, and to the point where the Russian foreign ministry or Lavrov or whoever can have some sort of input on who would get that position, or again the way Turkey does treat just the seat of the ecumenical patriarch. I mean, that could be a major shift. That could be something that again is potentially monumental.
Yeah, yeah, I concur.
But with that being said, again, Turkey is going to be one of those pivots on which the world hinges in the next several decades here, and I think a lot of people have overlooked that in light of conflicts in Russia and Ukraine, as well as what's happening in East Asia. I'm not saying China isn't a rising power. I'm not saying that China does not have a role to play on the world stage. It certainly does. Their economy is probably going to eclipse us within the next few years here, if I'm being honest. And I'm not saying that the issues around Taiwan aren't significant, but I do think people give a far more than it's warranted amount of attention to what happens in East Asia. Now, China as a world power, that's a different question. But I think the geopolitics of East Asia in particular, while not unimportant, especially over the past years, have been given a disproportionate amount of attention. I will say just that much on that note.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good that you brought this up because, well, for one, what were all the threats if you like were listening to you know well the NATO think tank that has this YouTube channel, I forget the name now, or CSIS, for instance. If you were listening to them, they, for the last 5 years, they would have said, "Oh, what is Russia going to do? They're just going to become a pawn for the Chinese." And this began to spill over into into basically administrative doctrine for the Biden uh, administration, right? And and a lot of people bought it, and there were a lot of uh, little accounts on Twitter that would repeat this over and over again. But the fact of the matter is, like, what this war has shown is um, there are lot of countries that depend on Russia, and when it comes to energy, um, you know, China needs Russia. Um, this week, the price cap that the U.S. regime has been saying that it wants all countries to obey was disregarded, and it was disregarded from countries like Algeria, but also China. Um, Even though that could help them out, theoretically speaking, right? Now, price caps are infamous for failing because not only do people find ways around it, but someone who is doing the selling uh, doesn't see it as a great profit, so they're going to hold back. They're just not going to produce as much. So, anyways, it's good that you brought it up because we're seeing just how integrated they are, and China, but also Turkey and Iran. These countries have all now accept the Russian Mir card, which is the Russian visa, and of course we have the enlargement of BRICS. Argentina has asked to join, and I believe Iran has asked to join. So there's a secondary system that is evolving here, right? And the squeeze is going to be put on Europe yet again, which kind of reminds you of the aftermath of the Second World War.
Yes, certainly. And with that, there is some news out of Europe, but I will just wrap up the Middle East first. You've gotten into some of the Iran news. But as it stands, Israel is set to go to election on November 1st. I know we talked about that being a possibility in the dissolution of the Knesset last episode, but Yair Lapid is the current interim prime minister of Israel. Biden will be meeting with him in a trip to Israel within this month, as well as meeting with Naftali Bennett, who is now the former prime minister of Israel. Now, Yair Lapid belongs to just one of the liberal secularist parties, and again, what I would like to call 1990s Zionism, that Israel is good because it defends the rights of women and minorities and LGBTQ, CIA, XYZ, whatever. So those are the people who are in charge of the interim government of Israel right now. Netanyahu, of course, is trying to make a comeback. He still hasn't faced any prosecution or any even legal troubles due to some of the allegations that were brought up against him in the recent few years. And then there also was, speaking of some of the news out of the Middle East, Biden has been begging the Arab nations for the past several months, I'm sure you know, mainly the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., who say that they've been drilling at full capacity to drill even more oil. And the G20 is going on, which I won't get into too much detail because it's still ongoing. We'll cover just some of the highlights next episode once everything has been said and done. But it was overheard at the G20. Macron was telling Biden that the UAE was at max capacity and that the Saudis can't produce anymore. And it seemed as if during his conversation with him and Biden's aides that Macron was more or less pleading with Biden in order to get the U.S. to fire up energy production again, in order to get the U.S. to,
Oh, wow.
yeah. So perhaps I make it sound more desperate, but it was a very intense conversation about energy production involving Saudi Arabia and even involving U.S. energy production at that point. So Macron, as more or less the figurehead of the European Union, I mean, of course, he can point to Schloss or whatever his name is. Merkel's gone. You can point to any of the number of talking heads in Brussels. But when it comes to the face of the European Union, at this point, it is French President Emmanuel Macron, who, mind you, as we covered last episode, did lose his legislative majority. His party lost its legislative majority. And at this point, he is appealing to the U.S. to make up for these energy shortages. And that is on top of the news that came out of Germany with, let me get the exact quote here. So, they have triggered an alert level of the gas emergency plan. The country is in short supply of natural gas, and the economic minister Habeck is saying that Russia has weaponized it against us, of course.
Mm.
So it appears that the figureheads of Europe, primarily out of France and Germany, are making a big overture to the U.S. to restart energy productions, which, although they weren't nearly as true believers as, say, a lot of elements within the U.S., it is interesting watching the people who really did sign on to a lot of the so-called clean energy proposals outright begging the U.S. for oil at this point. I mean, there's really no other way to put it, that they've crippled themselves, they've cut off Russia, the Gulf states can't provide that much. Iran, they're still in this very strange limbo with, to the point where, again, that leaves the U.S. has to increase production. Now, national average gas prices has jumped down, about like 15-20 cents, which is impressive because it does seem like that they're actually trying to address the gas crisis, at least coming up to the midterms. Now, the midterms I'll talk more in detail about as we get close to actual election day in November. So, hey, U.S. and Israel are going to be having an election on the same time. Who would have thought? Wow, it's as if it's as if it's just a repeat of the same event over and over. Ha ha ha! Making the you know, just running through the Zionist jokes as we get them. But point being is, um, way too proud of myself for that one. I may not sound like it, but I am. But point being is, with that, you have Europe, who is once again bearing the brunt of much of this, at least from an economic standpoint, begging their masters, just please, a drop of oil, sir. As as it were, and I really don't know. I mean, you already have that, coupled with discontent in Europe. I mentioned the French legislative elections. You have the protests of the Dutch farmers going on currently, where they claim to have been inspired by the protests in Canada at the beginning of the year, where they're using tractors to block the road and building huge convoys of tractors. And that's been an ongoing problem with the Netherlands and some of their agricultural issues in light of new policy. But it's only accelerated, and especially given everything else combined, yeah, it's becoming a major force. So you're seeing just small protest movements pop up around the continent, and I think it's more or less a sign of what is to come. But we're watching again Europe bear the brunt of this, and it's going to be a very painful near future for Europeans. And again, I'll reiterate what I was saying last episode. It's fun to joke about, but I am really concerned actually for the people of Europe. And I will also reiterate once again, not giving away my own plans or anything. You're in the sweet spot. You're in the sweet spot if you want to take a trip to Europe in the next few months. It's going to be really cheap to do stuff. I know like inflation and everything, but point being is coming in with the foreign money while the U.S. dollar is still worth something. Like I said, now is like the golden opportunity before the sun sets to have a nice little trip to Europe. Just a little piece of unofficial advice for anyone out there. But yeah, just watching all of this play out. I mean, I don't want to sound too what's the word cocky, too full of myself, but we addressed this back when all of this started. Even before the conflict
Yeah.
actually broke out, like you just at the end of last year, beginning of this year, this was on the horizon, and it was pretty easy to see if you would actually sit down and take the time to parse through a bit of the information. And again, I'm not happy right about at least most of this, but a lot of this just seems very obvious, especially now in hindsight.
Yeah, they are. I mean, you can see from the fallout what the strategy was, right? So, you know, Ukraine has received billions and billions and billions of dollars in aid, hundreds of billions, if you count the last 8 years in military hardware, and just basically propping up their government. Uh, uh, However, um, you look at the kind of military material that is being sent to Ukraine now, and you're kind of thinking like, wait a minute, why didn't they send this in the first place? Okay, so some of it is not performing that well, like the M777s. The Ukrainians are literally saying for the next batch, please don't send them anymore because 2 out of every 5 break down.
I
And
guess beggars can in fact be choosers.
yes, so about 40, and some of them as high as 45% are saying that these aren't working as well as we had hoped, and they need a separate kind of shell, and so on and so on. And um, so you're wondering, like, why didn't they send all of this stuff sooner? Of course, you know, in many, as Angela Merkel has pointed out, the whole point of the Minsk agreement was to prepare for this moment, right? It was to give Ukraine time to build up its military. But the plan was not really to engage with Russia for a very long time in Ukraine proper or on the border between Ukraine and Russia, right? The plan seems to have been enough weaponry that they would absolutely roll over Donbass, that Russia would intervene, but it would get bogged down. And the main reason for it being bogged down would be economic woes. And it would be perfect because that would bring on a color revolution in Russia, and Putin would be ousted, and a new detente could be arrived at. And Russia would probably have to, uh, it would give up the Donbass for sure. What would happen to Crimea would be maybe uncertain, but you can see that that was just strategy, right? A lot of good defensive weaponry to deal with Russia, with Russian tanks and aircraft. But I mean, it's not like Ukraine has lacked tanks. I'm just saying that the Americans could have given them even better hardware, let's say, right? But they didn't because they expected a quick victory for Ukraine, like really in a few months, and it would be over because the sanctions would kick in, all of that would work, and it would be over, and Ukraine would have the bargaining uh, uh, power in that arrangement, and that hasn't happened. So now they're scrambling, and I'm very sure they thought like, yes, once Putin is out, we will lift the sanctions, and and we can return back to normal, right? But that hasn't happened, and so now they're really in a pickle, and they, I mean, the 11 days are coming up in July, as I mentioned last week, where there will be no gas at all transiting into Germany. And it is Germany right now that is pressuring, well, I know we'll get into it, that is pressuring Lithuania to stop the blockade in Kaliningrad. So, um, yes, I don't want to uh, hog the issue too long.
Oh, it's no problem at all, and then pretty much sums up better than whatever I had in mind, and I can't really add too much to that. And you had mentioned uh, Germany putting pressure on Lithuania to back down. Just one last thing I would like to move on to before we get too far into some of the news about Ukraine, before I hand it over to you for your minutia minute, or should I say minutia 30 minutes, is that news out of Albania regarding NATO is that the Prime Minister Edi Rama confirms that NATO is in talks to build a naval base on Albania's coast. And this also coincides with a British deployment to Bosnia and Herzegovina, which some say is to counter any potential Russian influence in the Balkans via Serbia. And it does bring something interesting up that, of course, the West has been involved in the Balkans very heavily in the past 30 years. But beyond the US, the British have been the ones who have been very adamant about intervening and shaping the Balkans, whereas the Americans, to many surprise, including myself, have played a less ideological, more pragmatic game in the Balkans when they're very conditional about who they support and how they support them. And you have to
Mhm.
keep in mind that British intelligence does have a contingency plan to assassinate or otherwise remove from the picture Serbian leaders in Bosnia upon the outbreak of any civil war or any internal disputes, that they are prepared to kneecap Serbian influence in Bosnia, even ethnic Serbian influence in Bosnia, in the event that Bosnia were to ever break apart, which Bosnia is indeed a very fragile state, and perhaps that's why they're sending these to bolster it there. It's a very fragile multi-ethnic state
Mhm.
with a very complex political system. So we were discussing the viability of Bosnia surviving into the long-term future a few months back. It's something that gets brought up every once in a while. But point being is, I do think that they fear, much as honestly we did fear at the beginning of the conflict, that this has potential to spill over. Maybe not with directly Russian involvement, but just Russia's sphere of influence. We predicted that perhaps there may be another flare up in the Caucasus with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Even something may happen in the Balkans. And it does look like with this, they're either A, anticipating it, or B, trying to stoke it, which I wouldn't put it past either possibility with the British. And again, it seems that the Balkans are this very pet project for Britain. Of course, you have Boris Johnson coming out with a very passive aggressive statement saying, well, Putin has toxic masculinity, and if only Russia had a woman in charge, they wouldn't go to war. I mean, that there's a couple things about that.
It's pathetic.
I just want to address the tangent. Like, women rulers, especially from Russia, are no strangers to war. And number two, that isn't really a good selling point that, like, hey, we need more women in power, so when our nation is threatened or when your nation is threatened, they won't do anything about it. Like, I don't,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I know exactly what it's trying to accomplish there, but, like, again, just addressing that rhetoric in general, and, this is, of course, from a conservative stalwart in not only the UK, but all of Europe. This was Mr. Brexit himself. And yeah, it sounds like anything you'd get off of CNN or MSNBC. So I suppose that, I mean, it doesn't surprise me personally, but I suppose that just tells you where things are.
Yeah, I mean, what is Boris doing? I mean, he wants to use, this kind of bandied about remark that's popular in the Western cultural war that's been going on for the last 6 to 8 years, and apply it to Putin. Right? It's ridiculous because, well, I mean, you can look at the Queen Victoria. You can look at Queen Elizabeth. Uh, it's not only just not true.
You can
It's
look at Maggie
false.
Thatcher for a more contemporary
Yes,
example.
right, right. So it's first of all, it's false. Second of all, he's trying to appeal to offals, obviously. The urban offals, they're the ones he wants to maintain this. He needs their support, right? He knows that's waning, and of course, he wants to completely obscure why Putin is doing this. Like the audacity, like you really have to be stupid, or you have to be in the demographic. You have to be in the awful demographic in order to believe that Putin did this on a whim. Now, I get how that fits perfectly into the Putin is a dictator thing. They just do all this stuff, on a whim. Um, I mean, that makes no sense. It's like saying dictatorships, even by fools, can challenge liberal democracies any old time, no problem. That's ridiculous, right? So, like, but what I hate the most about it is it obfuscates the reason for the war. Like, Putin has literally been telling them since 2008. I mean, Russia collectively has been telling them since the 90s, do not expand NATO. And he's told them repeatedly since 2008, Ukraine is a red line. You do this, it's a red line for us. I don't care about like whatever you say about international law, blah, blah, blah. It's up to you. I'm telling you, you cannot have NATO bases in Ukraine. You cannot put your missile systems here. I don't care if you think that's a way to get to Iran. It's not.
Yeah,
There are
and
many countries closer to Iran. Like we are not going to tolerate this.
I'm
Just as
also
you would not
I'm
tolerate
a bit too proud
this.
of myself
And
for
like,
this one, but in response to the whole Boris thing, my immediate thought was, hey fellas, is it toxic masculinity not to want nukes within 5 minute flight range of your major cities? Like, come on, like. But
yeah,
with what you were getting at, I just have a couple other points just to touch on some of these cultural war narratives. Is that number one? I haven't seen it yet, but I'm surprised Boris Johnson has not been called transphobic yet for assuming the identity of any given individual, even Vladov Putler. Of course, I do remember. I do remember just going back seeing a Twitter post from like 2014 is even if German mustache man were transgender, it would still be wrong not to put German mustache man in a men's prison. Like so, it had reminded me of that number one, so they would even extend that sympathy. And number two, British liberals, especially like middle-aged British liberal women, are some of the worst people in any like global political discourse. They're some of the most insufferable
yes,
people. Um,
they're insufferable.
it is. I get in a lot of I run the risk of getting myself into a lot of trouble with it because
Yeah.
you know I used to engage with these people a lot, and again, not to get off too much of a tangent, but I would just like completely just like outright right off the Anglosphere and like wish damnation upon it. Like whenever, like to these people, whenever I would speak to them,
We're
I
gonna
would say,
lose followers.
yes. Honestly, like I would say my ultimate turn against the Anglosphere is thanks to British middle-aged British liberal women on Twitter. Like
Yeah.
it's amazing, and
I mean, nobody likes them, including the British.
yeah,
Just
nobody
saying.
no like, yeah, which is funny because on the other hand, like British boomer right wing women are like they'll like Fed post harder than any of us ever can. It's the best thing ever. Like just on the other side of the coin, like it's it's hilarious. It's like
Yeah.
it almost makes up for it. But I'm getting off topic here. So moving on to Ukraine, I suppose you can give your status report. In which case, I will see you in half an hour.
has developed since the show, since our last show. Uh, I guess the two really big news items, and I'll do my usual from the south going east, going north. So one of the big topics, one of the big news items has been Russia's evacuation from Snake Island. And I remember way back in March, like after the Russians captured the island, and there was all that nonsense about, the 12 brave Ukrainians who said "F you," and they were all killed. And it turns out to be like 83 border patrol guys, and there was no fight, nobody got killed. Anyhow, I said, like, I remember when I found out that you can shell Snake Island because it's so close to uh, Ukrainian shores in the east part of, sorry, in the western part of the Black Sea. It's also incredibly close to Romania. And I felt like, okay, why would you? Because missiles you can knock out. Okay, that's the thing. Unless they're hypersonic, you can knock them out. Shells are much harder. It's very hard to knock out a shell from a cannon. And indeed, that's what happened. And I think these are some of the howitzers that they got, the Ukrainians, that is, were shooting at Snake Island. And I've watched the video where they land like maybe 300, 400, 500 meters into the water, but some of them begin landing. And so after over a month of the Ukrainians literally throwing away 5 or 6 helicopters, uh, even before this, 2 Su-25s in the last 10 days were lost. Like men literally throwing away their lives to capture this island. That's, even if you capture it, who can stay on it before you're knocked off yourself, right? There's no room to pivot. There's no cover. There's no extensive underground system like for you to hide in and wait for the bombs to cease. All your anti-aircraft system is exposed. Like, how do you negotiate this? Like, you would have to own the shore closest to it. And I'm not trying to give Putin ideas. And there's no other way to defend this, right? If you don't own the shore next to it, it's virtually, and even then, in this scenario, and Ukraine doesn't have a navy anymore, it's impossible. So they finally left, and but today, the stupid thing that the Russians did is they said they did it to so that there wouldn't be a global grain crisis, as if like them being on Snake Island frightened everybody from transporting Ukrainian grain to feed the world. Like, Ukrainian grain does not account for much for like the developing world. Uh, the biggest supplier is obviously, well, it's Russia. It's not Ukraine. But it makes, like, the Russians are implicating themselves into this because they don't want to admit that it had become completely unsustainable to stay at Snake Island. They held on to it valiantly, and it cost the Ukrainians close to 100 lives just to try to take it. And but it worked. It was successful. They got the Russians to leave, and they got them to do it while the tail end of the Madrid NATO summit was still going on. And of course, it fits in with their with their Snake Island stamps, because they have stamps that literally, like, the government officially said the Snake Island thing that we said at the beginning of the war, that never happened. And yet they make a stamp that implies that it did once you see the stamp, right? It's so preposterous. It is an absolute upside down world. And so that's Snake Island. Now, the Russians aren't going to let anyone land on it, and I just saw Russian aircraft flying over it and bombing stuff. Obviously, they want to destroy any kind of infrastructure whatsoever, so there's nothing left of it. Anyhow, so that's that. Now, moving to the south, while we were still in the south, moving a little bit further north in Kherson, we had another attempt at an assassination, again using a car bomb, but no one was killed. This time, however, the terrorist was killed. They were eliminated. Another team driving a civilian vehicle also tried to plant another bomb. They were eliminated more towards the outskirts of the city. So the Ukrainians have also become fixated on Kherson and committing like car bombs and all of that kind of stuff. So, but that hasn't, so far, that's not working. Moving further west, we have uh, uh, debt forgiveness and pension payments being released, both in Kherson and Melitopol, and I'm going to assume also in Mariupol, on top of passports. Mariupol has now begun reconstruction. There are now houses and new apartments that are being built. So life is starting to return to normal there to a degree, as much as you can hope. And speaking of Mariupol, we have a switch, 144 switch in prisoners between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now, 42, 43 of these are Azov guys. 20 some odd were in the Azovstal metalworks plant. This has got, you know, Russians kind of riled up. And the chats that I've been reading through, you know, some of them are saying, you don't know, you know, maybe they haven't done anything. It's not their leaders. It's, you know, there's all kinds of reasons. But one of the interesting things is on Twitter, there was a guy that posted photos. So all the guys from Azovstal that are actually being traded, all of them have lost a limb. They are severely injured one way or another. And I guess the Russians presume that they haven't done anything. I don't know. I know they've been gathering evidence on, you know, the guys who have been torturing civilians in that area. I guess these guys don't fit that bill. I don't know. Another 172 bodies were found in the Azovstal in the last 7 to 8 days. So if we continue to move north, some of the shelling in Donbass by the Ukrainians using the new hardware, whether it's the French Caesar or the American M777, has died down. I'm not saying it stopped, it's died down. And this is mostly because of pressure that is mounting on Ukrainians in the Severodonetsk and Lysychansk amalgamation. So Severodonetsk is now absolutely liberated. It was like, I think, liberated the day after we aired the last episode. And Lysychansk now, half of it is controlled by the Russians. There have been severe casualties on both sides in street fighting, but particularly also for the Ukrainians that got swallowed up in that pocket south of Lysychansk in the Zolotoye and Gorskoye cauldron. There have been flights of Ukrainian forces fleeing out of Lysychansk, but they presume there are still thousands that are still stuck in the city. Like I said, the gum factory, there's a gelatin factory there, and an oil refinery in the southern part of Lysychansk that the Russians have taken over with the
Everything you need to run a
Lugansk.
civilization.
Yes, so that has been captured a few days ago, and really, what's you know, there's only one road, one rural road for the Ukrainians to get out of there, and anybody who's stuck there now, I think they're going to end up being prisoners. Remember, Russia has, even with this exchange, Russia has well over 5,500 Ukrainian prisoners. Russian prisoners are less than 500. After this exchange, they're probably more like 350, 375 max. So the next ring of defense now will be southwest of um, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. It will be at Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Bakhmut. This is another complex. Like all of these cities are highly industrial, right? They're not necessarily that big, but if you count Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, I always said it was around 190,000, 200,000, but there's another little town called Rubnoje, and these other little towns that are effectively they're in the same exact region. If you count them, that's 355,000. So the city is just a little bit smaller than Mariupol, which was around 400,000. Some say more like 425, 430. So it's just a little smaller than that. I'm not sure about the size of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. I understand one of those cities is on a hill, so taking it will be difficult, just the way taking Popasnaya was difficult. But after the Russians took Popasnaya, it gave them that commanding view, and it is from this salient that they have been able to close off Lysychansk. If that had not happened, Lysychansk would not be half conquered now. Even Severodonetsk progress would have slowed down on it. And so now what we have is basically this is the last frontier of the Donbass. Everything after here in a western southwestern direction are much smaller towns. They're more rural. They're much harder to defend. There are the extensive network of tunnels and ditches are not there, or they've only started working on them now. The other areas to watch out for are the areas directly next to Donetsk city, like I mean around the area of Sparta and Pesky, around that area, or around Gorlovka. So I believe that after Lysychansk falls, rather than now there is a salient that's forming. They want Lysychansk completely cut off, and it is going towards another town, yet with another name that sounds repetitive, called Seversk. Just Seversk, not Severodonetsk. It's just Seversk, and it's on the way to Slavyansk. I believe that they want to cut. They're just going to do that to cut off the Ukrainians from being able to go to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. But I think what will happen is the Russians will now be able to go from the rear of the Ukrainians and begin taking care of those areas that are directly adjacent to Donetsk city and Gorlovka. That will return life back to normal in Donetsk, which means it will the Ukrainians will not be able to divide the Russian attention. Not that their attention has been very much divided, but the attention between getting rid of the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass area, particularly the northern Donbass, or trying to go into the most heavily fortified and best trained areas, which are directly adjacent to Donetsk city. Because remember, that's where many of those battles that people saw on YouTube over the Donetsk airport, that's what I'm talking about. And the little town just outside that airport is Pesky. So that's the only other news. Odessa had one of their recruitment barracks destroyed, I believe, yesterday or today. There was another industrial facility in a part of Kiev that was destroyed. This set fire to a mall, and there's all kinds of arguments about whether the mall was targeted or not. And, you know, like the Ukrainians will not stop putting their military hardware near civilian areas because it is a way for them to slow down the advancement of Russians. Even that guy, his last name is Kim, in I believe the Kherson region. No, Mykolaiv. He was on video and he started ridiculing women who said, "Can you not park your tanks close to our schools and or my house?"
Yes, and
And he said,
you'll recall. I mean, this isn't
and he's
unprecedented.
like
For example,
laughing at it, like saying like, "Oh yeah, maybe I won't do that. Maybe I'll let the Russians just storm through," which kind of gives everything away.
yeah, you gotta respect it when somebody who's ostensibly just low IQ and comes out and just gives away the game. You gotta love that. But
Yeah,
this isn't anything new. And just going back to earlier in the show, part of the reason the advance through IDLIB has been so slow is for that exact same reason. Because, of course, military targets hidden in civilian areas, and I mean, it's as old as this third generation of warfare is itself. So it's not really anything new or unprecedented. I'm not saying that makes it right, but again, it's not like a lot of people are acting like this is just completely unheard of. But again, it's to be
yeah,
expected when you fight a nation state on nation state war, as it were, or even in a more unconventional war. For example, um, some of the wars the U.S. has gotten involved in, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan, that has also been a common. It's just a really common defender's tactics. But yeah, again, you are using your own civilian population as a human shield. That is admittedly true, and you just gotta love it when somebody who's probably like room temperature IQ and comes out and is like, "What do you mean you don't want to be within risk of an airstrike? Oh, you should be more grateful to us." Yeah, yeah, those are real fine, upstanding people, as I'm sure you
yeah,
all
yeah.
know.
And this video is when Ukraine kind of still had something of an air force, right? Like this is from like I believe it was March or April, like back when they could have made certain decisions that could have maybe turned the war in a different direction, but they didn't. But as far as Ukraine, that's about all I have on it. I am very sure, as I always say, the show will end, and I'll remember two or three things. But
Well, you probably missed the most important piece of news out of Ukraine this week.
what's that?
General Pavel. Russia's scraping the bottom of the barrel. So, for the
Oh
context, I
yeah,
believe it was New York Post or one of these other tabloids comes out with this picture of this really fat guy in military fatigues and like a formal cap, which I thought was just strange in general.
he
Like,
is a big boy.
yeah, and I don't know. I think they say he's like 350 pounds. That Putin's scraping the bottom of the barrel because the Russian officer corps has either been lost in combat or has refused to command this war. So Putin is scraping the bottom of the barrel. I just want to address a few things. So, as was pointed out to me by a Russian guy I know, apparently those fatigues belong to the Ukrainian border guards. Number one. So there was that. There's no other source in this guy beyond General Pavel, which is a first name. There's no even indication at what a surname might be.
Yeah,
And also, one thing I will address that is very nitpicky. I don't see how being, a fat ass, all fairness, impedes your ability
to
to
be a
operate.
general.
Yeah, to operate in a war room and say, and move pieces around on a map and say they go here, they go here. I mean, it's not like he's not like a field commander or anything. So it's like, yeah, he's a big boy, but like, I don't think that impedes his strategic mind, which is at that point with the kind of job that he is allegedly in, which I do not believe for a second that he is. It doesn't really impede the job. It just seems like, I mean, yeah, compared to like Western generals, compared to the men who wear the women's uniforms and people like that, and what's his name, Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, compared to the kind of people within like the Western ministries of defense and the Western's departments of defense and the Western militaries, I don't see how one fat general would be scraping the bottom of the barrel. Now maybe if Putin was pulling out some sort of pink haired man, that might be a different case. Uh, but it,
Or a skinny or a skinny Russian woman who's also a vegan.
too good, too good. But yeah. Also, that's on top of Putin has both Parkinson's and cancer and is going to die in 3 weeks.
Yeah, oh, yeah,
He put Shoigu in the gulag. Yeah, all of it's true definitively. Okay, so uh,
yeah.
but
Remember when they had Tim Curry from Rocky Horror Picture Show They used because he was like a character in a video game
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the
That
war.
I'm trying to remember. It was the Command and Conquer games, like with
Yeah,
the
Command and Conquer games, and they've tried to pass off Tim Curry as the latest Russian general to get killed in Ukraine. And
yeah. I think that was
this is
actually
like the
like
Ukrainian government
yeah
publishing this stuff, or the Ukrainian military. Like, think about that.
yeah, I think that was a coordinated prank where like there's like one network of people who like do the stuff in Russia. I know they prank call like a lot of Western
Oh
politicians
yeah.
like do stuff like that. I think that was one of their
Oh, that guy
projects.
Lexus and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, like those those few Russian guys who do that. But yeah, I mean like But point being is the Ukrainians still took that bait. So yeah, it looks like they're
Yeah.
really winning the information war out there.
Yeah, I mean, Russia doesn't do very well with information war or propaganda, to be honest. Uh, Snake Island is a prime example, but they do have some potential talent. They love trolling. They're better at just trolling.
Yeah, that seems to be the go-to. But I just had a couple more stories. So there was that piece on CNN with some talking head. Let me find his exact name because that was just wild. Let me see who he was. Oh, it was an actual Biden advisor. I thought it was just a Biden shill, and his name is Brian Deese. He said in response to the person interviewing him, and I quote, "What do you say about those families who say, 'Listen, we can't afford to pay 4.85 a gallon for months, if not years?'" Then the Biden advisor responds, "This is about the future of the liberal world order, and we have to stand firm." And this has been a narrative that's been going around since the beginning of the war that's only intensified within about the past month or so. Well, of course, it was the Putler's price hike at first, but now it's you're paying a premium on gas to defend the fate of democracy itself. And they're trying to bring back these illusions to the even civilian sacrifice that had to be made for the war effort in World War II. That it's just some grand struggle that we all have to be united with in a nation. You have to be willing to tolerate a little bit of pain so we can come out in triumph, even though this isn't even a war we're directly involved in. This is a proxy war we're fighting via Ukraine. And they want to hammer this narrative home. This is something that, of course, we have said for years. It's something they're outright coming and saying that, oh, yes, you have to do it now. And that one of the other ones is it was a few weeks ago. Some journalist came out and said, if you're talking about gas prices over what was it? It was some culture war issue. I know how you would have voted in 1933. Like
Ah,
just like stuff like that. It like and there was the best ones like would you rather have gas at $2.50 a gallon or democracy? And it was on Twitter, but ironically enough, he didn't make it a poll, and so there was that as well. But they're really trying to hammer home this new narrative that, of course, your civilian sacrifices are needed in order to ensure a victory in the war effort. Now, if I had to speculate, I think a lot of what's happening now is we're facing the inevitable consequences of actions that have been set in motion over the past several years, not past several decades. And they're just trying to give some nice padding so you feel good about these inevitable consequences unfolding right before you. I've said before, even if the U.S. does fire up its energy industry again, it's going to be a long while before,
well, it
say,
takes years to develop these things.
yeah, it takes years to develop these things. It takes years to get them back online, and then on top of that, getting things to actually balance out in the market, like fixing the damage that has been done, like trying to bring prices back down, trying to bring some degree of stability, and that's on top of getting just the mechanical side of and the technical side of things functioning before you even see the effects in the market. So it looks like, especially for the kind of audience that would watch CNN, they're pardon the pun, priming the pump in order to get you to accept these gross increases in cost of living, gasoline, food, groceries, etc. And they're trying to again make you feel good about that and trying to paint some overarching narrative as if it were for some sort of greater good, and not either for a the incompetence of the regime running the economy to the ground, or b them deliberately running the economy to the ground. Which I think there's a fair case to be made for both, and possibly both those cases are right, where it's a little bit of both.
Hmm.
And I did just have one last story to cover in light of the situation regarding Roe versus Wade. So, of course, there has been major backlash to this from the usual suspects. Congress has been flipping its lid, and you even had Pelosi, the current Speaker of the House, come out and say, well, the Supreme Court is. I'm trying to remember the exact word, trying to say something along the lines of it's an organization that's enabling political extremism in light of this, and that we need to hold the Supreme Court to account. There's been just this complete narrative shift overnight, as to be expected, where they're really trying to ramp up this rhetoric. They're trying to talk about how, of course, this is going to lead to 6 gazillion deaths from medical malpractice and coat hanger whatever, and the usual stuff. Hey, let's put on our bonnets and red dresses and go uh, do whatever the hell is their new routine now. I know they've been doing that for a few years, but it looks like that even among the ranks of the establishment, and again, we speculated some of the more underhanded reasons that this decision may have been made, but we have what we're looking at right here is, I suppose, that wasn't an agreement in unison on the part of the establishment. You have Biden coming out and a lot of Democrats in Congress coming out saying they want to get rid of the filibuster so they can force through just with a simple majority, a federal legislation on abortion in order to, secure the so-called right, whatever. But it looks like this has really ramped up things internally in an empire that already didn't have great cohesion. You're putting this kind of economic pressure on people, and then you now have probably one of the biggest culture shifts, culture shocks, I should say, at this point, in the past several decades when it comes to the repealing of this issue, and that's going to be a nasty legal fight all around on state and federal level. And again, you already have courts in you have district courts who tried to strike down these laws, despite the fact that the Supreme Court actually had to remove some uh, some district court judges for trying to repeal a law that they, of course, said that would have been okay under this most recent ruling with Dobbs. But not to get too much into the legal nitty gritty, it looks like that whatever reinvigoration this was supposed to be for, say, the core American, so to speak, the kind of people who are really the backbone of the empire, that it's had just as much backlash. And it will be really interesting, just on a grand scale, to see what the overall effects of this are in terms of imperial cohesion and what it means. And maybe it was a complete backfired attempt to try to, again, reinvigorate the core class of Red America into being more supportive of the empire. But once again, it's one of those things. There's a lot of possibilities you can go down, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this for weeks to come as more stories develop out of it. Now, that is all I had for today. If you think I missed anything, by all means, now would be the time.
Well, nothing that you missed. I was just going to say two interesting, funny stories out of Ukraine again. One is the Ukrainians used a picture of an American porn star named Harrington, who is supposed to be a Russian soldier who was killed in Donbass. And the way he died was his tank got hit, or he saw a tank that got hit, and he went to rescue the guys, and then the tank blew up.
Yeah, I believe it.
It's just laughing. It's just laughing at the other side's heroism. Like, and it's a porn. Like, you can tell. Oh my god. And I mean, the other thing is more mercenaries have been caught. So a Polish mercenary has been caught. Two more British mercenaries have been caught, and an Israeli person, merc, has been caught in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, I heard the
So,
Israeli got sentenced to death by whoever in
yeah,
Russia was trying him. In which case, I suppose this is just the new Slansky trial. Just a dark shadow of persecution of what over under the Iron Curtain of Eastern Europe. Putin is really just bringing back all the horrible, horrible things. Yeah, totally not that they captured a foreign war criminal and brought him to
Yeah,
justice. No, it's another Slansky trial, and
yeah.
I'll even
I mean,
say that. Yeah, I mean
just
that's not even a fair comparison because it implies the Slansky trials were unjustified.
right, right. And let's not forget that many of the new little packets of military aid that are have been flowing. This is not the 46, 52 billion. These are like 890 million, 458 million pounds. Uh, but particularly the American packets that are now going over, uh, particularly for the HIMARS, and they are going to get like the longer range, 100,000 kilometer plus missiles. Uh, there's a very interesting video by Zelensky. You can probably find it on Telegram somewhere, where you know he needs more money, and he says, "I spoke to the Jewish committee in America to spend more arms."
So Congress.
Yeah. So there was some. Yeah, so that was interesting.
Yeah,
But that's all I have.
they have a propensity to rat themselves out. So that's um that's very entertaining as usual. But that is all I had for this week. I will actually be uploading this upon the finishing and recording, so it will be a same day episode. And I had almost forgot, especially with you here. It is, as I am told, Canada Day once again. So
Yeah,
I don't know
I've
if you
never been
guys
so proud.
still get to celebrate that, but if you do, have a good weekend, I guess.
Thank you.
But that's all I had for this week, and of course, this will probably be the last show before the fourth. So because that's in a few days. So happy Fourth
Yeah.
to our American listeners, and I know we're speaking to a minority of our audience right now, just talking about the Anglosphere here, but and there's a few of you left, surprisingly. But
Why, I don't know.
the foremost English language anti-Anglosphere show on any internet platform. We kind of got a niche market cornered. So thank you everyone for tuning into this episode, and we'll hopefully see you next time. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.